On a warm September night in 2019, the quiet of Dallas, Texas was shattered by a frantic 911 call. The voice on the other end? Trembling. Broken. A woman fighting against panic as she pleaded for help. Please, please hurry. My cousin, she's not breathing. There's blood everywhere. The caller identified herself as Monique Harris, a 32-year-old nurse who had just come home from a grueling 12-hour shift. Exhausted, still in her scrubs, she stepped inside her duplex on Malcolm X Boulevard, only to be thrust into a waking nightmare. Her cousin, Alicia Carter, just 25 years old, was slumped in the living room, motionless, a dark crimson stain spreading across her chest. And just a few feet away lay a pistol. Police raced to the scene. Paramedics stormed inside, only to confirm the worst: Alicia was gone. A single gunshot wound had ended her young life in an instant. The weapon? A .380 caliber pistol, registered to Monique Harris herself. Shockwaves rippled through the neighborhood. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. How could this have happened? Who pulled the trigger? And then came the whispers that would tear this case wide open. Some claimed they heard shouting inside the duplex shortly before the gunshot. A man's voice, angry, confrontational. But others swore they had only heard Monique and Alicia arguing before tragedy struck. The scene painted a chilling puzzle. No signs of forced entry. The murder weapon tied to the woman who made the desperate call. Gunshot residue found on her hands. Was Monique Harris the grieving cousin who stumbled upon a tragedy? Or was she hiding a darker secret? What detectives didn't know that night, what they would soon uncover, was a web of love, betrayal, and jealousy so twisted it would shake even the most hardened investigators. Because Monique and Alicia weren't just cousins. They were bound by a secret that could destroy reputations and ruin families. A secret love, forbidden, hidden in the shadows. And at the center of it all, a jealous ex-lover who refused to let go. A man whose obsession would drive him to the brink of murder. This is the story of a forbidden romance, a jealous rage, and a life stolen in cold blood. Blue and red lights danced against the brick walls of Malcolm X Boulevard as patrol cars screeched to a halt. Officers rushed into the duplex, weapons drawn, hearts pounding, unsure of what they might find. Inside, the air was heavy. The faint metallic scent of blood clung to the living room. And there she was, Alicia Carter, only 25, her body crumpled against the sofa, her chest soaked in red. On the carpet, a .380 caliber pistol lay just 3 feet away, cold and silent, yet screaming with the weight of what had just happened. One spent shell casing glimmered faintly under the harsh beam of the detective's flashlights. The crime scene was methodical, almost surgical in its stillness. No broken locks, no shattered glass, no sign of forced entry at all. Whoever had pulled that trigger hadn't broken in. They had been let in. Or worse, they already lived there. And standing just outside, trembling and sobbing into her uniform sleeve, was Monique Harris. Her voice cracked as she repeated the same words again and again. I just found her like this. I swear, I don't know what happened. To the officers, she looked every bit the image of grief, shaking hands, frantic eyes, her voice quivering on the edge of collapse. But grief alone wasn't enough to erase suspicion. Because the gun, the very weapon that ended Alicia's life, was registered to Monique. Detectives Adrian Cole and Vanessa Price were assigned to the case. Hardened veterans of the Dallas Homicide Unit, they knew better than to trust first impressions. The weeping cousin outside could be a heartbroken witness or the killer herself. Neighbors were canvassed immediately. Several swore they had heard raised voices between 9:15 and 9:30 that night. Shouts laced with anger, followed by a single, deafening gunshot. One neighbor insisted it sounded like a man's voice. Another thought it was a heated argument between two women. Confusion deepened. Which version was true? Monique was taken downtown for questioning. Standard protocol demanded that she be tested for gunshot residue. When the results came back, officers' stomachs tightened. Positive. Both hands. It was the evidence they dreaded and expected all at once. When confronted, Monique broke down. She swore she hadn't fired the weapon. She said she had tried to lift Alicia, pressing her hands against the wound, desperately trying to save her. Maybe, just maybe, the residue had transferred that way. The detectives exchanged skeptical looks. The explanation was possible, but unlikely. Gunshot residue on both hands. That was far too much for incidental contact. Meanwhile, technicians bagged the weapon and combed the duplex for fingerprints. The pistol casing was collected, every surface swabbed for DNA. Still, one detail chilled investigators to the bone. The lockbox where Monique kept her pistol? It was in her bedroom, unlocked. No signs of tampering. The implication was terrifying. Someone close, someone trusted, had been inside. By the end of the first night, detectives had more questions than answers. Why was the weapon registered to Monique? Why did her hands test positive for residue? Why did neighbors report hearing an argument when Monique insisted she had just come home? And then, the first crack in Monique's story. When pressed about her relationship with Alicia, she hesitated. Her eyes darted. Her voice faltered. And finally, through tears, she admitted the truth. They weren't just cousins. They were lovers. A secret romance, born in the summer months, hidden away out of fear of judgment from family and colleagues. It was a confession that stunned detectives and complicated the entire case. Was this a crime of passion between two forbidden lovers? Or had someone else, someone with a far darker motive, pulled the trigger? The puzzle was only beginning to take shape. And soon, the investigation would reveal another figure in this twisted story, a man whose obsession would plunge everything into chaos. Behind the sterile walls of the interrogation room, Detective Adrian Cole leaned forward. His voice was steady, probing, but edged with suspicion. Monique, why didn't you tell us everything? At first, she tried to hold the lie together. She insisted that she and Alicia were just family, nothing more. But her hesitation betrayed her. Her eyes welled, her hands trembled. And then, almost as though the weight of secrecy became too heavy to bear, she confessed. She and Alicia Carter had been lovers. The room went silent. Even the detectives, hardened by years of brutal cases, exchanged a glance of surprise. For Monique, this was the truth she had buried deep. A truth she feared would tear her family apart and ruin her reputation as a nurse. They had started as cousins reconnecting after Alicia moved from Fort Worth that summer. They shared laughter, long talks into the night, the kind of emotional bond that grew stronger with every passing day. But somewhere along the way, that bond shifted. Friendship blurred into intimacy. Desire. Love. Monique's voice cracked as she recalled their secret world. The way Alicia smiled when no one else was looking, the nights they spent curled together, whispering about a future they weren't sure they could ever have. To them, the duplex was more than just a home. It was a sanctuary where they could be free, even if only behind closed doors. Yet every secret carries a price. They never told family. They avoided questions from friends. At work, Monique wore the mask of professionalism, terrified that gossip could expose her truth. Alicia, too, kept quiet, though she once confided to Monique that the secrecy was suffocating. Still, they clung to each other, choosing love in the shadows over rejection in the light. But now that secret was out, and in the eyes of investigators, it changed everything. Because hidden relationships breed suspicion, passion, jealousy, motives. Detectives scribbled in their notepads, weighing the possibilities. Was this romance truly as tender and supportive as Monique described? Or had it soured into conflict, boiling over into violence? Monique swore there had been no fight that day. She said she left for her shift, worked 12 long hours, and returned to horror. She insisted they had been happy, stable, loving. But neighbors remembered voices raised in anger before the gunshot. Could Monique have snapped in a moment of rage? Was the secrecy itself tearing them apart? The detectives weren't sure. They pressed harder, looking for cracks in her story. Monique held her ground, even as her tears fell freely. Still, deep inside, investigators felt the story didn't fully align. Something was missing. Someone else lingered in the shadows of Alicia's past, a figure whose presence loomed larger with every new piece of evidence. Because while Monique painted a picture of love and tenderness, Alicia had once belonged to someone else, a man who did not let go so easily, a man named Derek Johnson. And unlike Monique, Derek wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was lurking, watching, sending messages filled with venom and rage. The secret love affair was no longer the only piece of the puzzle. Now, investigators had to confront a chilling possibility, that Alicia's past had come back to claim her in blood. While detectives wrestled with doubts about Monique Harris, another name surfaced again and again in whispers, phone logs, and fragments of testimony. Derek Johnson. To most, he was just another warehouse laborer in Fort Worth, a man in his late 20s who blended into the crowd. But to those who knew him intimately, Derek was a shadow that loomed large, a presence that left scars long after he was gone. Alicia Carter had once loved him, or at least, she had once tried. But love with Derek was not tender. It was suffocating. It was controlling. Neighbors in Fort Worth remembered the fights, the yelling, the slammed doors. Police had been called more than once, though no charges ever stuck. Alicia's friends described Derek as charming in public, but explosive in private. When she finally broke free in June 2019, packing her things and fleeing to Dallas to live with Monique, it wasn't just a move. It was an escape. But Derek didn't let go. He never let go. The detectives soon learned of the trail he left behind. The calls, the voicemails, the relentless stream of text messages that filled Alicia's phone in the weeks before her death. Messages that shifted from pleading to threatening, from just talk to me to you'll regret this. And on the night she died, at 8:57 p.m., one message stood out like a dagger. You'll regret ignoring me. It was the last text Alicia ever received. Detectives Adrian Cole and Vanessa Price now saw the case in a chilling new light. Perhaps Monique wasn't the jealous lover after all. Perhaps she was caught in the crossfire of Alicia's dangerous past. When officers tracked Derek down at his mother's home in Fort Worth, he played innocent. He claimed he hadn't seen Alicia in months. He denied being anywhere near Dallas the night she died. His tone was calm, detached, even bored. But then came the evidence. Cell tower records placed Derek's phone pinging near Malcolm X Boulevard that very night, in the exact window of time Alicia was killed. Surveillance footage sealed the blow. A gas station camera just blocks from Monique's duplex caught a dark sedan creeping through the streets at 9:12 p.m. Another clip showed that same car speeding back toward the interstate less than 30 minutes later. It was Derek's car. When confronted, his mask of indifference cracked. He stammered. He admitted he had been in Dallas, but only briefly, he claimed. He parked down the street, tried calling Alicia, and when she refused to see him, he drove away. It was a weak story, a desperate story, and it was about to collapse entirely. Because forensic experts soon found what Derek couldn't explain away: gunshot residue on his hands and clothes. Not the faint trace that might linger from a firing range days earlier. No, these particles were fresh, consistent with a recent discharge. And then came the discovery that turned suspicion into near certainty. Just 3 days after Alicia's death, Derek had walked into a pawn shop on Lancaster Road. Surveillance footage captured him sliding a handgun across the counter. A .380 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The very same caliber used in the murder. He thought he could erase the trail by filing off the serial number. But it was too late. The timing was damning. And still, the most chilling detail remained. Back at the crime lab, fingerprint examiners combed through the pistol found at Monique's duplex, the supposed murder weapon. They found something unexpected. Not Monique's prints on the grip. Not her fingerprints on the trigger. Instead, a partial fingerprint belonging to Derek Johnson. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to shift. Monique's tears, her grief, her desperate attempts to save Alicia, they no longer looked like guilt. They looked like tragedy. The true shadow, the true danger, had never left Alicia alone. He had followed her, haunted her, and on that September night, he had taken from her the very thing she sought to protect, her freedom. And yet, even with this mounting evidence, detectives knew the fight was far from over. Because if Derek Johnson thought he could intimidate, manipulate, and control Alicia in life, in death, he would fight just as fiercely to escape justice. The battle was shifting from the streets to the courtroom. And there, the truth would face its ultimate test. For all the cracks forming in Derek Johnson's story, investigators could not, and would not, let go of Monique Harris. Because the evidence against her still screamed too loudly. The gun that killed Alicia Carter was hers. The residue on her hands tested positive. And she had hidden a secret relationship from detectives until it was dragged into the light. To the outside world, it was damning. To prosecutors, it was enough to keep her under the harshest scrutiny. And so, while Derek sat in Fort Worth pretending to be innocent, Monique sat under bright interrogation lights. Her grief twisted into something darker: accusation. Detectives leaned hard on her. They pointed to the residue, telling her it was far too concentrated to be incidental. They reminded her that neighbors heard an argument, maybe even her voice. They pressed her about jealousy, about fights, about what could have possibly pushed her over the edge. Monique's tears flowed, but so did her words. She insisted she had not fired that gun. She insisted she loved Alicia. She admitted to panic, to pressing her hands against the wound, to maybe brushing the pistol in the chaos, but never to pulling the trigger. Still, doubt gnawed at the detectives. Was she just a skilled liar? Was her grief real, or a mask for guilt? Days passed, the weight crushing her more each hour. She had reported the crime herself, yet that act seemed meaningless. Every look, every question, carried an unspoken accusation. You killed her, didn't you? And then came the cruelest blow of all. Whispers in the courtroom of public opinion. Some relatives recoiled at the revelation of Monique and Alicia's romance. What had been their secret sanctuary was now a weapon against her. To some, the forbidden nature of their relationship painted her as unstable, deviant, capable of anything. It was unbearable. She had lost the woman she loved, and now she was losing her reputation, her freedom, even her identity. But as the storm raged against her, science began to whisper a different story. Forensic specialists re-examined the gunshot residue. This time, the results told a subtle but vital truth. The particles on Monique's hands weren't distributed like those of a shooter. They weren't blasted into the creases of her skin by the recoil of a fired weapon. They were smudged, transferred, secondary. In other words, her explanation fit. She had touched Alicia's chest. She had clutched her cousin's body in panic. And in doing so, she had unknowingly picked up the very particles that made her look guilty. Her tears, once seen as manipulation, began to look like what they truly were. The raw anguish of a woman holding the lifeless body of the person she loved. Yet, detectives didn't let her off the hook immediately. Not yet. The weapon still tied her to the crime. The lack of forced entry still suggested familiarity. Suspicion still lingered in the corners of the investigation. But as more evidence emerged, the threatening text from Derek, his presence near the scene, the pawn shop pistol, and finally, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, the scales of justice began to tip. Monique wasn't the predator. She was a victim too. A victim of a twisted investigation, of secrecy turned into suspicion, of a society that looked at her love and saw shame instead of devotion. By the time detectives faced her again, their tone had shifted. No longer was she the prime suspect. Now, she was a broken witness, a grieving survivor, and perhaps the only person who could illuminate the depths of Alicia's fear in those final weeks. The storm around Monique Harris was clearing. But for Derek Johnson, the storm was only beginning to break. Because every piece of evidence, every footprint, every particle of residue, every fingerprint was pointing straight at him. The case against Monique Harris was fading, but detectives knew the real killer was still out there. And every trail, every scrap of evidence, led back to one man, Derek Johnson. At first, Derek played the role of the smooth talker. He told investigators he had been nowhere near Dallas that night. He swore he hadn't seen Alicia in months. He laughed off their questions, shrugging with practiced indifference. But the truth was already unraveling his lies. Cell tower data placed his phone pinging right near Malcolm X Boulevard, the same neighborhood, the same hour Alicia Carter took her final breath. The gas station footage sealed the timeline. His sedan creeping toward her home at 9:12 p.m. and fleeing just minutes after the fatal gunshot. When pressed with the evidence, Derek cracked. His confident mask shattered into stammers. He admitted, yes, he had driven to Dallas. Yes, he parked near her duplex. But he insisted he never went inside. He claimed he just sat in the car, sent her texts, and left when she refused to see him. It was a story made of splinters, sharp, but impossible to hold together. Because the texts told another story. Threatening, menacing, full of fury. One just a week earlier. You think you can erase me? Another. You'll see what happens. And the last, sent only minutes before Alicia's death. You'll regret ignoring me. Every word dripped with rage. Every message reeked of control. Then came the science. The evidence Derek couldn't charm his way past. Gunshot residue lit up his hands and his clothes like neon. And when he tried to explain it away, saying he had been at a firing range days earlier, detectives pounced. Where was the receipt? The log? A witness? He had none. His excuse collapsed under its own weight. But the investigation wasn't finished with him yet. Because 3 days after Alicia's murder, Derek had made a mistake that screamed guilt. He walked into a pawn shop and slid a pistol across the counter. A .380 caliber semi-automatic, the exact caliber used in the killing. The pawn slip showed no serial number. It had been filed off. But timing is a stubborn witness. The transaction occurred just 72 hours after the murder. And then, the final nail in the coffin. Forensic analysts called detectives back to the lab. They had combed the pistol found at Monique's duplex, the weapon once thought to incriminate her. What they discovered sent a chill through the room. On the slide of the weapon, a partial fingerprint. Not Monique's, not Alicia's, but Derek Johnson's. It was as if the gun itself had testified. Monique's story of incidental contact with the magazine suddenly made sense. Her palm print there, smeared in panic as she tried to lift Alicia's body. But her prints were nowhere near the trigger. Derek's were. Piece by piece, the case against him grew undeniable. And yet, Derek clung to his crumbling lies. He claimed the prints must have been old, from months before. He said he had pawned the gun for money, not to hide evidence. He insisted the threatening texts were just words said in anger. But the evidence was merciless. Cell tower records placed him at the scene. Surveillance cameras caught his car near the duplex. Gunshot residue clung to his skin and clothes. Threatening texts revealed motive and intent. The pawnshop pistol connected him to a cover-up. Fingerprints on the weapon tied him to the act itself. It was a storm of proof, a tidal wave no lie could hold back. Detectives Adrian Cole and Vanessa Price gathered their files, their witness statements, their forensic reports. They no longer saw Derek as a suspect. They saw him for what he was, the killer. On September 20th, just 6 days after the murder, officers surrounded his workplace in Fort Worth. Co-workers watched in stunned silence as Derek Johnson was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed, his face pale, the weight of inevitability pressing down at last. For Monique Harris, the nightmare was not yet over. But for the first time since she found Alicia's body, she could breathe. The suspicion that had nearly destroyed her life was lifting. And the man who had haunted Alicia, who had stolen her future in one violent moment of rage, was finally behind bars. The noose had tightened, and it would only grow tighter when the case went before a jury. Because now, Derek Johnson would face not just detectives, but the full weight of justice. 9 months after the night that shattered lives on Malcolm X Boulevard, the case of the state of Texas versus Derek Johnson finally came to trial. The courthouse buzzed with tension. Reporters filled the benches, their pens poised. Family members sat with heavy hearts, waiting for answers, waiting for justice. And at the center of it all, Derek Johnson, dressed in a suit that fit like a disguise, his eyes darting, his jaw clenched. The prosecution wasted no time. From the opening statement, their narrative was clear. This was not a mystery, not an accident, but a cold-blooded execution fueled by jealousy and rage. They painted Derek as a man obsessed, a man who could not accept rejection. They described how Alicia Carter had fled from his grip, seeking freedom with Monique Harris, and how Derek had driven nearly 40 miles that night to snuff out a love he couldn't control. The defense, in contrast, leaned on doubt. They tried to shift the shadow back onto Monique. They hinted at jealousy within the forbidden romance, at secrecy that could have boiled over into violence. They reminded the jury that the murder weapon had been hers, that residue had been found on her hands. And so the trial began, a battle of narratives, with Alicia's memory at its center. One by one, witnesses stepped forward. First came the neighbors. Their voices echoed through the courtroom as they recalled that fateful night. The shouting, the heated argument, the unmistakable presence of a man's voice. And then, the single gunshot that silenced everything. Then came the experts. Forensic specialists took the stand, dismantling Derek's lies piece by piece. The residue on Monique's hands? Secondary transfer, consistent with her desperate attempts to save Alicia. The residue on Derek's? Fresh, embedded deep, the unmistakable signature of someone who had fired a weapon. The surveillance footage was shown next. Jurors leaned forward as the grainy video flickered on the screen. Derek's sedan gliding past the gas station just 2 blocks away from the duplex. Another clip showed it racing back toward the interstate, the clock ticking dangerously close to Alicia's final moments. And then, the text messages. Each word delivered like a knife. If you think you can move on without me, you're dead wrong. You'll regret ignoring me. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jurors scribbled furiously on their notepads. The venom in Derek's own words needed no interpretation. But the most devastating blow came with the fingerprint analysis. A crime lab expert walked the jury through the details. On the slide of the .380 pistol, Derek's partial print. No prints from Monique on the trigger or grip. Only hers on the magazine well. Exactly where she claimed to have touched it while lifting Alicia's body. It was as though the gun itself had testified, pointing its finger at the true killer. When Monique Harris took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She was not just a witness. She was a survivor of suspicion, grief, and unimaginable loss. Through tears, she recounted the love she and Alicia had shared. How their bond grew in secret, hidden from a world that would not understand. She described the way Alicia had confided her fears, Derek's threats, his anger, his refusal to let go. I loved her, Monique said, her voice breaking. I loved her more than I've ever loved anyone. And that night, I lost her. I came home, and she was gone. And I can't ever get her back. The defense tried to rattle her. They pressed about jealousy, about secrecy, about the residue on her hands. But the jury had already heard the science. They had already seen the texts. They had already watched the video of Derek's car creeping toward the duplex like a predator. Finally, Derek Johnson himself took the stand. His lawyer urged him to speak, to give his side. But under cross-examination, his story collapsed. Why was his car at the scene? He couldn't explain. Why did he pawn a .380 pistol just days later? He stumbled. Why did his fingerprint rest on the murder weapon? He grew angry, his voice cracking, his excuses unraveling. The prosecutor's final question thundered in the silence. Mr. Johnson, if you didn't pull that trigger, then tell this jury, who did? Derek stared ahead, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning in his own lies. No answer came. 2 weeks of testimony ended in a single day of deliberation. The jury filed back in, their faces grave. The foreman rose, the verdict trembling on his lips. Guilty. First-degree murder. The words echoed through the courtroom like a gavel striking steel. Derek Johnson's mask fell away. He slumped in his chair, his fate sealed. Judge Eleanor Hughes delivered the sentence with cold finality. Life imprisonment without parole. The man who tried to control Alicia in life would now lose control of his own, forever. And in that moment, Monique Harris, though still broken, though still haunted, was finally free from the weight of suspicion. She left the courthouse with tears streaming, knowing justice had spoken, but also knowing justice could never give her back the woman she loved. The gavel's echo faded, but the ripples of this case would last forever. Derek Johnson was led away in shackles, his life no longer his own. For him, freedom was gone, replaced by cold steel bars and endless nights haunted by the choices he made. A man who once believed he could control Alicia Carter with fear and violence would now spend the rest of his life powerless, locked away, consumed by the shadow of his own rage. But there was no victory in that sentence. Not truly. Because nothing, no verdict, no prison term, no stern words from a judge, could bring Alicia back. She was only 25. Young, radiant, full of dreams she never had the chance to chase. A life stolen, not because of a stranger's hand, but because of a man who once claimed to love her and could not accept letting her go. For Monique Harris, the end of the trial did not mean the end of her pain. She walked out of the courthouse cleared of suspicion, but her heart still carried the weight of loss. She had endured the unthinkable, finding the woman she loved dying before her eyes, being accused of her murder, and then testifying in the very trial that exposed every hidden truth of their relationship. She was free, yes, but she was also broken. Friends say Monique struggled for months after the verdict. Nights where sleep refused to come. Days where the world felt empty without Alicia's smile. And always, the gnawing thought. If only she had been home earlier. If only she had seen the warning signs sooner. If only. But there were no ifs strong enough to rewrite that night. Detectives Adrian Cole and Vanessa Price closed their files, knowing this case had taken them through a maze of suspicion, secrets, and heartbreak. They had seen how fragile the line between love and violence can be, and how quickly obsession can turn into something lethal. And for the public, the story lingered as both tragedy and warning. A reminder that secrets can leave us vulnerable. That obsession can disguise itself as love. That jealousy, unchecked, can destroy not only lives, but entire families. In the end, this was more than just a murder case. It was the story of two women who dared to love in the shadows, and of a man who turned that love into a weapon. Alicia Carter's life ended on a September night. Monique Harris's life was forever changed, and Derek Johnson's life was caged behind bars. Three paths, all shaped by one truth. When love is poisoned by control, when jealousy becomes obsession, the outcome is almost always the same: sorrow, devastation, and blood. So tonight, as we close this chapter, remember, a secret can be fragile, a relationship can be dangerous, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not strangers at all, but the ones who once swore they loved us.